Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Founder Hour podcast. I'm your co-host, Pat. Today's guest on the show is Jeremy Kai, founder and CEO of Italic. Italic is an online retailer on a mission to reinvent the way we shop. They currently offer hundreds of quality products ranging from clothing to cookware from the same manufacturers as top brands such as Aloe, Rag & Bone, and Armani for up to 80% less. We had a blast getting to know Jeremy and talking about his upbringing and early career, why he started Italic and the long-term vision for the company, some of his observations growing up around manufacturing, and much more. If you want to check it out, the team at Italic was kind enough to extend a unique offer for our listeners. Get 30% off your first year of membership when you sign up at italic.com/founder-hour. Hope you enjoy. Jeremy, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. We're both huge fans of Italic and members as well, and can't wait to kind of hear about how you started it. But before we do, tell us a little bit about your personal journey, personal story. Where did you grow up? What were you like as a kid? What were you into? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. So thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, to answer your question, I have I have your tech background to like a stereotypical T. So I grew up in Chicago in a small suburb. My parents were first generation immigrants from China, and I grew up there. Went to school out in a small school called Babson in Boston, and then from that point onwards, I followed the stereotype. So I dropped out, I moved to San Francisco, started my first company, did this accelerator called YC, did the Teal Fellowship, which they basically pay you to stay out of college, which gave me the justification to my Asian parents to stay out and yeah.
I love your modesty, the small school, back from college, did this thing called YC. So let's talk about that, because I went to USC and I studied kind of like the entrepreneurship, kind of track there. And I remember every time, we would look at like the standings, or people just like would talk about it, like Babson College is like the best entrepreneurship school if you want to learn it. And then YC, obviously, we can talk about too, which is, the probably the most successful, accelerator program, in the world. But I guess, when you were kind of before you even went to college, what kind of stuff were you into? Like, what did you want to be when you grew up? Did you have any idea of like a particular career path or anything that you enjoyed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to put it is I grew up in a very classically stereotypical, Asian immigrant family in the Midwest, which is like deeply centered around education and work ethic and so on and so forth. But what happened was my parents, my mom specifically started a string of small businesses, kind of chasing that like American dream, and started with like, I think it was like a vegan cheesecake company in Chicago. Like this was maybe maybe like 25 or so 30 years ago, and then like a couple of years after that, like started another one. And there's like a string of kind of things that didn't work out, but then one of them was a manufacturing company, which became kind of a lot of like what our family time was associated with. My dad like ended up kind of leaving his job and working for my mom, so it's a little bit atypical in that regard. But that was kind of the environment I grew up in. It was deeply kind of centered around like these classic, Asian American values of education and college and all this stuff. But at the same time, there's this whole like route of, my mom was really into entrepreneurship and being a founder herself, although in a very different way than the way I do it today. And I think that served as a kind of strong backbone actually for not just what I do today, professionally, but also like the industry that I work in. That was like kind of ultimately where the idea for Italic came around. So.
So Jeremy, you talk about, your parents kind of being in the manufacturing business. It's very similar to me, actually. My dad's more on the jewelry manufacturing side, and he's always, been doing that. And that almost involves some level of like artistic skill, which I definitely don't have. But when I was growing up and watching him do this and, doing it both at a large scale, small scale, suffering, not suffering, like going through all these ups and downs that, you have in that business, but also just in manufacturing period, because, you're not only competing with folks here, you're competing really with the rest of the world and labor costs, etc. When you were a kid, you know, did you want to be in that industry? Because I know myself, I definitely didn't. But I'm curious, like, you know, growing up around it, what were your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, like I totally agree with you. Manufacturing is not a good place to be. I mean, honestly speaking, it's very competitive. It's as a company, like it's very competitive. It's very low margin. You know, it's a little bit like of a tougher, you know, crowd, and you know, growing up, it's like definitely, you know, when you visit the factories, and it's like it's really not what you want to be doing. But at the same time, like, hey, it's how things are made and how the world kind of operates. So, and how you buy something from a store, like it was made somewhere, whether that was in the States or China or whatever it was. Um, so from, I guess, like to your point, from an earlier age, I definitely would agree with you. I definitely didn't want to be in that side of the business. And even when my mom was saying like, "Hey, you know, do you want to kind of like one day take over the family business?" I was like, "No way." And same with my sister. There's like, it's very much something that I think you like don't, most people would not see the appeal of. But I don't know. It's a means to an end, I think, and it's if you enjoy it, it's a great place to be. If not, it's a very not good place to be.
What were some of your like takeaways when you were younger from that business, and something you learned about it? You know, that obviously has led to you, you know, kind of getting back into that space. You know, now that you know you kind of started your own company. Was there anything in particular that maybe people don't even know about manufacturing, or like behind the scenes, that something you learned that you realized like there's something interesting here?
Um, yeah, I'd say that the two things that people, um, I would say, like I probably took away myself, was one. I think we had a one time where we had a quality control mishap, and my parents are in like auto and industrial, so it's like the thresholds and tolerances for you know, error rates are very low relative to, like, let's say, apparel or textile, where the thresholds are a little bit higher. And for auto, like, hey, if you screw up like one component in a batch of like I don't know, 100,000, like that means the whole batch, you have to look through every single piece, you know, audit it. And I think for us, like, that one mishap, I think, ended up costing like basically an entire year's worth of revenue. So that I think, like, from I remember that being like a very scary year for the family. And then I think at a second point, I think like you also realize like what a, frankly, like a bad business model services and having clients really is, because you're so dependent on your client base that if you lose one, like that means you have to, there's direct costs to that. You know, when you're in manufacturing, every deposit, every receivable you get, it goes towards payroll, you know, labor, headcount, equipment, materials. And if you lose one of those, you know, clients, your marquee clients, like a lot of those, that headcount has to leave. A lot of the equipment's not being utilized, and you have to fill that pretty quickly. So I think you realize pretty quickly, if you're in a services business, like, hey, this can make cash flow, but like the margins, typically speaking, aren't great unless you offer like a really specialized service, which manufacturing is the exact opposite of specialization, where everything's a commodity for the most part, you know, especially when you talk about globalization. And then I think on the flip side, you know, you're kind of constantly at the whim of your client requests, and if they need a lower cost, you know, you have to kind of deliver. Otherwise, they might go and counter source you. So it's a really hard business, but I think it really teaches you, like, one, the value of building like IP or things that are scalable, and then I think secondly, you know, the value of having like a strong quality control system from day one. So those are just two things that come to mind.
hmm And I'm sure we'll dive a lot deeper into this when we, you know, transition to the topic of Italic and how obviously that came to be and everything else. But you know, just to take it back just a little bit, uh, when you were at Babson, you know, what was the goal, right? Like, did you want to come out of it with, you know, a job? Did you want to come out of it with, you know, your own business? I mean, why and why'd you even go there? Like, out of all the schools in the country, why Babson?
Yeah, it's exactly like Pat mentioned. You know, when I never got in like the big, you know, Ivy Leagues and all that, unfortunately. But I did try, and I think when I didn't, Babson was a pretty compelling option. And the number one for entrepreneurship, I mean, they tout that everywhere. In reality, like, what does that actually mean? Like, you can't actually, you can teach it in a classround, but like, you really
Yeah.
you kind of gotta do it yourself. To know what you can learn all the case studies, you can go over all the case studies, you can like learn about all the things, but like at the end of the day, it's like you kind of have to do it. And a lot of the skills they teach you, I think, are useful, like from whether it's like from a technical level or like a financial level or whatever it was. But the reason why I went to Babson was I knew I wanted to follow kind of my mom's footsteps of starting a company at some point. Had no idea what it would be in. Just knew that was like kind of what I wanted to do. And when I didn't get the chance to go to like those, prestigious, schools that would make your mom happy, I was like, okay, well, I got to prove myself another way. And I went to Babson. And I think the first year I realized like, hey, you can't really learn this in a classroom. You kind of have to like go out on your own. And especially in Boston that time, this is like 2013, 2014. I think like a lot of that was the peak of like the whole college hackathon season where a lot of these colleges were throwing these hackathons with like big corporate sponsors, and they were like a big deal. In reality, looking back, I was like, cool, I can't believe they got like kids to do that. But
Yeah.
I think it's really inspiring as a young adult going into college. Like you get to see and speak with like I got in a 1 month span. I was like, I'm not trying to name drop it. It's just like Boston had this like really thriving community of like, I think Travis from Uber came over and spoke, like Evan from, Snapchat, back when it was still Snapchat, Alexis from
Yeah.
Reddit. And they were all like part of, they came to for campus recruiting, over at Harvard and MIT, not Babson. I would go into, Cambridge for that. But I think that was like a really impactful experience for me. And I think ultimately it's like, oh, this whole technology thing is very compelling. And I think like if you're starting a company in anything today, you might as well try to do it in San Francisco, and you might as well try to do it in technology. So, yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like we had a very similar college experience because I was in college around the same time and doing the same thing, studying entrepreneurship, and like I kind of remember those days, and it kind of felt like it was a big transition from like where we were with like that early like web 2.0 tech revolution to like getting into AR VR and all these like web 3.0 type things, and it was an interesting time, and I couldn't agree more in terms of the entrepreneurship thing about learning it in school, because it's funny. Like I had professors that were like academics in entrepreneurship, right? They had like a PhD, like literally, like they had PhDs in entrepreneurship, but had never ever started a business, right? And it was interesting. Like for just one example, it was a project, and our group project's idea, we had to come up with an idea and like a business plan and everything. And this was 2013, and it was a Bitcoin bank. Like we literally decided, let's create a Bitcoin bank, right? And I was like a Bitcoin credit card. I was like, just and we took the idea to the professor, and he was like laughing. He's like, all right, go and do something real, like real, right? This is a joke, right? So anyways, that it would have been nice to start that business back then. But the reason I say that is because I'm curious, like in terms of your experience in your classes, what did you kind of learn or take away as someone who went in wanting to be an entrepreneur? And would you recommend going to college for entrepreneurship or studying entrepreneurship to people who kind of have that bug early on and want to learn it in a more structured environment?
Yeah. And by the way, I think like, yeah, I think I went to like Hackasia a couple times, and also I think like one of the first places I tried to intern was Coinbase, and this place at the time there's like Buttercoin, if you remember. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
hey, you'd probably be retired by now, so sorry to hear that.
Yeah. It's all good. It's all
No,
good.
I totally I agree with you. I think I'm not trying to talk down at Babson. I think it's a great place. I think I did like make a lot of good friends there, and the people, like the staff, and I'm not trying to like butter it up in any word. It's just like I think it's a great place to have a basically like an undergrad business environment if you didn't get into Wharton. And I think for me at least, like there were a number of things that I think I took away. Like one, I realized, hey, I can't do engineering. I can't do web development. I can't do like software engineering. So I've got to figure out like what else that is. Babson's is in this like consortium with Wellesley, which is like more liberal arts, where you could take classes there, and then Olin, which is like the heavily engineering focused school. And when I ever try to do anything with the Olin kids, it's like, oh, I'm so outclassed here. So I knew that wasn't for me. And then I think secondly, they have this class, I think it's called FME, where they basically like have first year kids like come together and start startups. You can imagine like, oh, great idea on paper, and then in execution, it's like everyone goes on Alibaba and like, it'd be like, I'm going to make a shirt, right, and sell it to all my parents.
Yeah.
Not that that's a bad thing. Again, I think that's actually very, it's a valuable experience for most people to realize like, hey, entrepreneurship is not for me, and for like 99.9% of the world, that's the case. And I think like it teach a lot of the kids there who go there for the sake of, let's say, entrepreneurship. It's really for like family businesses who are set to take over as like a second or third generation owner. And I think it's a great structured environment for them to kind of just like have peers to build. Yeah, it's the same as any college, just like build lifelong relationships with there. Um,
Right.
but I think for the sake of like starting a business, I mean, you don't really see Babson on the top of like any you know founder lists anytime soon. So not that that's a bad thing, but I think
Yeah, I
like,
agree with that social component, like you
yeah.
just mentioned. That's probably the most important thing, because you're at least in the same environment as a bunch of other people that are like-minded or think the way you do, and most likely, they're probably going to go on and do something, in that, in an entrepreneurial way. Like some of my classmates have gone on to build incredible businesses, and it's like just cool to come up together, right, and just like bounce ideas off of each other, or even just like be a resource to each other in whatever path you decide to go in after college, right? So that's
And,
kind of, yeah.
and Jeremy, I know that you obviously stayed, and then ultimately you drop out. Uh, you know,
I'm technically on a leave of absence still.
okay, so you took a leave.
I'm just
You
kidding.
took a permanent leave of absence, I assume, or temporary, whatever you want to call it. But you take a leave of absence. What was the plan? I mean, what even led to you coming to that decision of like, you know what, this isn't what I want to be doing right now. I want to be doing something else. I mean, was there a plan for what that something else was?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of first time founders, like the excitement around starting a company outweighs the actual company itself. And what I mean by that, this is very true for me. For the first company, was I didn't care what industry I was in. I didn't care like what who I was working with. Like all the things that like you should really really care a lot about. I really didn't care about it. It was more like, hey, I want to start a company, and I'm going to go until like I do that. And at the time, you have like all this hustle and built up like energy that you want to put towards something. And I think like in that environment, like you get so tired of going to class. And luckily, Babson was one of the places where they would take like a ton of I was the kid in high school that took all those AP classes, so I had a ton of credits to bring over, and I could justify to my parents like, hey, let me give me one semester like to try out something. And I moved to San Francisco, didn't ask for a cent from them, lived like couch to couch and ate burritos all day. But that, I think, that semester off really gave me the kind of environment to realize like, hey, this is a much more conducive environment to starting a company, because it's the only thing you focus on, not like your next test or your next paper. Not that you can't start a great company like in school. I mean, plenty of people have started way bigger companies than I have, in school. But I think for me, it's just like a forcing function of, I'm going to force myself to get out and have one semester to prove it to not only myself, but to my parents to allow me to kind of like gracefully, exit school. And I wouldn't say there was like a specific day that I realized that, but I think it was just like over the course of a couple months where I realized like, hey, I'm going to be much happier, like not sitting in a
Right.
classroom.
It's definitely a very ballsy move for lack of better words, because I know a lot of people, including myself. I went to undergrad plus grad school, so in those 7 years, probably every other day I had the thought about, I could be doing something else. But there's always that fear of like, well, what if the grass isn't greener on the other side? Like, what if I'm not going to be happier, right? What if I am going to be part of that 99.9% that fantasizes about being an entrepreneur or going and working at some company, and I'm going to hate it and I should have done that instead, right? There's all these like what ifs that stop people from pursuing anything, not only just entrepreneurship, just pursuing a love interest, or pursuing buying a home, or right, whatever the case may be, right? So why do you think you had that confidence, right? And I'm really digging deep here, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that might be in that position, whether they're in school now, whether they're at another job, that are listening, and they may not have that confidence that you did. But I want them to be able to relate to you, perhaps, and say, you know what, I'm gonna take that leap of faith, like even if it doesn't work out.
Yeah, I think specific to founders, I would I mean, I have to say this, like, honestly speaking, I think 99.9, I said this previously, but I feel like most people in the world should not be founders. And there's a very good reason why, which is like this job is horrible. It's like you're gonna lose hair, like lose sleep. It's not healthy. I know there's a stereotype there, but I think the stereotype is more true than not. And I think, but I think for those people who like have it in them, like you said, you know at some point you're going to do this anyways. And I think the question is like, why not today, right? Or why not like tomorrow? And you can always push that decision off. And there's a lot of societal pressures, or family pressures, or social pressures, like telling you like why you shouldn't do it. But I think if you have that in your gut telling you like you should, um, I think the question more so that you should be asking yourself is like, yeah, why shouldn't you? Why can't you do that today versus like why do you have to wait a year? Like why do you have to get that promotion? If you have that in you, I think like that's a good forcing function to kind of get you to start thinking more aggressively or boldly. And
Mm.
for what it's worth, not everyone has the support network or the the risk tolerance. You might have a family, you might have like very little, you might have a ton of student debt. Like, thankfully, I'm not saying thankfully I didn't have either, but I'm saying like, I think I was in a fortunate situation when you're younger where you can take that leap of faith with a family that can support you that way. So I was lucky in that regard, but I think, I don't know. I feel like if you're going to do it, you're going to do it at some point, and whatever the next step is, like that you're kind of setting yourself up as like, oh, once I do that, I'm going to take the leap. Like, generally, you're
Right.
going to have another step after that. So I don't know. It's a tough one because again, I'm in the camp of like, hey, most people should go to college and like get a 9 to 5, because I think that there was a stat where like 80% of the American workforce doesn't have a single identifiable passion, and that's okay. Like, I think it's most people just don't like want that in life,
Right.
but if you do, you might as well kind of go for it.
Right. And you know what? That's a great answer. And the reason why we ask that question, and we've asked it several times, is because sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, every person has a different story, different circumstance, right? There's not a one size fits all type of like solution to these questions or these problems or whatever. But I think that as a person, you know yourself, right? You can self assess, and ideally you're self aware, which I think is it's a huge skill to be self-aware of like your weaknesses, your strengths, your risk tolerance, etc. And then you just kind of take the leap of faith. But you're right. I think the reason why we started the Founder Hour was to learn more about the person, right? Of course, the company as well, and we'll talk about everything you've done, including Fountain, which you launched after you took this leave of absence and not dropped out. But you know, it also tells people, you know, how difficult it is and how challenging it is. And we want people to understand, and, through the stories of others, that yes, it is a very sexy thing if you become successful, right? But even the people that we interview sometimes don't end up becoming uber successful. There's been several times and several people we've interviewed in the past 3.5 years that haven't reached that level, and it's okay. They'll go on and do other things. They'll go on and advise people. They'll invest, etc. So I guess thank you for that answer. I thought it was a great answer. What was fountain.com? I mean, and why did you think that this was a great reason to leave school?
Yeah, I mean, I really, Fountain's a great company today. Like, it's still going. My co-founder and I have exited, and both of us have a great, relationship with the CEO who we brought in, and also with each other. So it's there's nothing like, no, I didn't leave on like bad terms by any means. But I think the Fountain, for those who kind of are listening, it's an enterprise hiring automation platform for large scale workforces around the world. And just saying that out loud, I think if you think as a, like 19-year-old kid dropping out, like, I mean, you're not dropping out to do that, right? Like, that's not what your like whole life is about. It's a great business. Like, I think, again, I just want to make that clear. It's a great business, great team. But I think the reason why Keith and I started the company, the number one reason wasn't because we had like an excitement around the industry or around each other. Like, we had actually just met. And both of those are like red flags to anyone who's investing in this. And it was really just like, hey, we want to start a company, and like, we're two ambitious young guys in the heart of Silicon Valley, and we're like, let's do this, right? We had met on a Facebook group called Hackathon Hackers, which is this like huge community of like young engineering type of guys, and women as well. And I think, and I think for us, like we had really founded it off of the premise of like, let's start a company as opposed to like understanding deeply the problem. And frankly speaking, we just got really lucky. We had been in the right place at the right time. We were competing against these two like super impressive like Stanford MBAs who had started a company around the same time. And I think if I have to be honest, it was just like me giving up like 5 10 years of my life in exchange for beating them out on like raw hustle and the ability to work off of like less sleep. And that's it. The first couple of years, it's really, it was really kind of straightforward because it really was all about kind of following that path that the rest of the industry set for you. But I think a couple of years in, if you're trying to recruit that next person and you're giving the whole spiel around the mission and the vision and values, and ultimately like you don't personally find excitement in that, it burns you out really quickly. So I think that's ultimately why I wanted to kind of work on something I was personally very passionate about and excited about. And it's all the fuzzy stuff that like as a kid you say like you pass it off, it's like that doesn't matter, but at the end of the day it really did. So so that was fun, and still going today. I think it's still going strong with a much more capable hands, frankly, than I think we were. But it was a great kind of jumping point for me personally, at least.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and it's something that I've gone through and I've seen so many examples of where, it's you kind of you have that bug, you want to start a business, you start it just to start it. You might see some sort of opportunity. It might not be something you really care about, but hey, why not? Like there's a business here, and that could work. And I think passion. I'm of the firm belief that passion could be developed. Some people are just passionate about making money, and that's fine too, right? But if you really know that you don't see like a long term future in that, you have to understand how much work and effort and time and how much of your life and sacrifice goes into building a successful business, that if it's not something that you see yourself, in my opinion, doing for like at least 10 15 years, if it's the case, like maybe it's better that you go work somewhere that you do have a little bit of interest in that industry, earn your stripes, meet people, gain experience, and throughout that, like you mentioned before, if at some point you'll start a business one day, then you're always you have that open mindset of seeing just opportunities if they arise. You're more likely to see opportunities that way than doing something that you don't even care about, right? Because like you said, when it comes time to hire people, now you're managing people, you're in charge of their well-being and making sure that they're paid and everything's good with them and they're happy. And if you raise money, now you have investors to answer to, and all that kind of stuff just adds more weight, that if you didn't even care about the business in the first place, like it's going to be a really tough hole to get out of once you're in it, right? So I couldn't agree more. But I guess talk to us a little bit about your, YC experience. Anything like there that stood out that would be good to share, or was it kind of what you thought it would be, not what you thought it would be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a funny trend with YC founders, which is every subsequent year you kind of look down on the next batch because it's like, oh, it's a little bit bigger, the partners are a little bit worse, like blah blah blah. But I know, I think at its core, YC is like a really great catalyst for younger founders or people who like have really know what they're doing to jumpstart the startup experience. And really, like, we could talk about the dinners, we could talk about like the deals, the network, all these things individually, but at its core, I think ultimately what it does is like it is a highly intensive like 3 month experience where you do the only thing you focus on is this company, and the only thing you care about is growth and getting this month over month, like everyone wants this like J chart at the end of the experience so that you can present it at demo day. And it's a pretty conducive experience, but I also think it weeds out like the people who were in it for the wrong reasons. Like if you thought a startup was like this rosy kind of thing that like you're a product manager at Facebook and now you want to do this thing, and there's a lot of great startups founded by Facebook PMs, but there's also a lot of duds that I think it was just like PMs that thought it would be easy and just like running a product team. So I think YC is a really cool. I think of it as like a spawning pool of just like interesting ideas. There's a ton of pivots that happen during the batch. You meet a lot of really interesting people, and I think now they've scaled it to a point where like I don't recognize I don't know any of the companies in there. I don't know any of the partners anymore. But at its time, and even to this day, I hear great things. I think if you're a second time founder or a third time founder, it's like, hey, the value add might be not as strong because originally you would do it for the network or
Right.
or the demo day. But I still think it produces like amazing companies, if not better, year over year. So I only have good things to say. Your
Yeah.
mileage may vary. So
It's like the undergrad experience for starting a startup as opposed to like the grad
yeah, right,
early stage stuff. Yeah.
right.
So, Jamie, I am curious a little bit about Fountain before we, go into what you're doing now. But you guys, and I don't know if this happened during your time or after your time, but a lot of these big companies that a lot of people know about, whether it's Uber, Airbnb, Target, Safeway, just to name a few, they all use this platform, right? How, what made it? I mean, what does this platform really do for these businesses, and why do you think, beyond the fact that you said that you worked really, 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 really hard and worked longer than everybody else, why do you think that this product worked and obviously works now?
Yeah, I mean, look, the true answer is we were in the right place at the right time. So the original idea was like, hey, applicant tracking systems are not like they're most of them were built. The good ones, the new ones, like the levers and the greenhouses of the world, they were built at a time when and for companies that serve knowledge workers, so engineers, designers, marketers, whatever it is. And I was working at a company called Ship at the time, SHYP, that was like an on-demand shipping service, and we had to hire all these couriers, which our ATS, lever at the time, like clearly was not built for. So I think when Keith and I got together, he was already working on this, so it's not like I'm coming up with the idea, but I think we jammed on this idea quite a bit, and the idea was like, okay, what if we built basically a customized, like verticalized, applicant tracking system for large scale workforces that don't care so much about like what design program you know how to do and how many years, but more so like, hey, do you fill these roles with the right people like as efficiently as possible? um, Automated background checks, automated document signing, automated phone screening, automated phone scheduling, so on and so forth. Text messages, which was much more efficient than email. And our initial client base was all these on-demand companies. So at the time, it's like the heyday of the Uber for X's, where everyone was starting some version of that. And we had sold into a lot of those clients. And in that case, like when you're selling to startups, the only thing that really matters is hustle. In my opinion, you just like got to be persistent. Build. They want this. Oh, let's go build it tonight. And that was the first like 2 years, and it was really kind of thrilling because I would like have the night shift and Keith would have the day shift. I would do sales to our European customers and like tell our contractor engineering at the time, like in the morning, like, oh, here's what they wanted, and then I'd go to sleep, and then they'd build it, and then I'd wake up at night and be like, oh, it's done. So it was this kind of like rinse and repeat cycle of building a SaaS tool for this like little niche market. And then we just when I say we got lucky in the sense that like, hey, this use case extended to a lot of companies outside of on-demand companies. So like the Targets and the Safeways and so on and so forth. So we were able to cross that chasm, which is, what everyone says SaaS companies
Yeah.
need to do into enterprise.
You mentioned a couple years in having that realization of like, well, maybe I'm not as passionate about this as I thought I was, and having that thought. But I think I saw that you were at Fountain for about 7 years. So you were there for a little while, after that. What ended up happening? Like, why did you end up leaving, or did you sell? Like, were you trying to sell? Like, kind of walk us through sort of the end of the journey there, before we get into Italic.
Yeah, so I was at Fountain for almost 4 years, and I just have that, when you start a company, you got to keep that founder title forever. It's a badge of honor.
Yeah.
So I've been a founder for 7 years, which is crazy, but but especially since I feel like I was a kid when I started it, but yeah, I think like for Fountain, the reason ultimately that I think like it didn't work out for me was it really came down to what we were building and what I was excited about. For me, B2B SaaS is a pretty grueling, place to be if you're not into it. You got to be on the phone all the time. You got to be like enterprise, hard. The sales type of person, like who's super outgoing and like likes that. That's not me. So I think I had that realization like 1 year in, but I grinded it out for another couple of years, up to the point where I was like, okay, we have the team. I'm not a single point of failure anymore, so the ball doesn't stop with me. and if I leave, like things aren't going to kind of shut down. And I was able to kind of like part ways really on good terms with both the board, whom I still chat with all the time, as well as my co-founder.
So you're like, okay, 4 years in, just for reference, what is that, around 2018?
Yeah, that's right. And by the way, I'll just add one thing to that as well. I think I was very lucky in that regard. If you were a solo founder, or if I was the CEO, I probably wouldn't have had that opportunity. But because my co-founder and I were, pretty close by then, and because I wasn't the CEO, I was able to kind of be in a very fortunate position where I had that option to gracefully exit. But if that wasn't the case, that would have been much harder. But yeah, I was there
Mhm.
until um, uh, basically, I think my last day was formally like January 1st, 2018, and then I had a 3 month, technically a 3 month break before Italic, and then we were off to the races. So a very short kind of
Was that an
uh,
intentional break, or did you kind of leave not really knowing what you were going to do, and like what was kind of that period looking like?
no, I think for me, I didn't I left around the same time as like when I realized like, hey, this is really what I want to be doing. And I think like over the past year, I had spent a lot of time with my family and my parents, um, just like kind of rehashing out ideas. And I think like the idea for Italic really came from manufacturing again, where it's again a very low margin, very competitive business, and ultimately the longer you work in the business, the more you kind of wonder like, hey, I'm producing finished products for someone else, and they sell it. They buy it from me for this price, and then they'll sell it for 5, 10 times what I sold it to them for. And that inherently like sucks as a business, right? Because you're losing out on all of the upside. And I think we just got to thinking like, okay, well, what if there are other ways to, change the supply chain? Like there were a lot of direct to consumer brands that had claimed these like. I don't want to jump ahead. I don't know if
Yeah.
you had other questions on that, but
Well, you're never jumping the gun because we're having a conversation here. So you're the guest. You in
thanks.
on this show, your conversation and your answers help us lead the conversation. But I am curious. Obviously, we talked a lot about the manufacturing stuff early on with your mom and your dad being in the more so, I believe you said
Mhm.
automotive manufacturing business. Um, Obviously, the SaaS stuff, nothing to do with manufacturing. Um, did you always in the back of your mind have that question that you just talked about of why are these manufacturers missing out on, perhaps more profit, or how can that be different? Was that always on your mind? Was that something your parents perhaps talked about when you were a kid? Or was it just like during that 3 month period, you're just kind of, in this mode of like, I'm not really, really working super hard, and now these ideas are coming up. So talk to us about how that initial idea was like even birthed.
Yeah. I feel like when I feel like founders have this like interesting journey where like day one, you know nothing, but you have a lot of confidence, and then like there's you learn a lot, and you're like, oh, you fall on your face a ton of times, and then like you come to a point, I think like in my case like 3 or 4 years, where like I'm on top of the world, I know how to do this thing, like, it was easy, right? Like been doing it for a while, and then you have that like deep confidence and you apply it to everything you go to. So you see this all the time, right? Like you look at healthcare, like, oh, I could solve that. Like you look at supply chain, I could do that. I think for me, I kind of went in with that like very clear eyed naivete and confidence into manufacturing with my family business, where I was like, hey, what you're doing is dumb. Like you got to drop everything, and like like let's tech this thing, and apply like a YC mentality. And obviously, looking back, it's like a very stupid thing to do. But I think with my family, at least I was like, that was a lot of the conversation. It was like, well, why can't you raise your margins? Well, like there's competitive pricing pressure, and there's a lot of manufacturers in any single category. Well, like why don't you try to sell to the customer? Because there's no like rails for distribution for a manufacturer, right? Like that's why retailers and brands exist as kind of intermediaries of trust
Right.
between a manufacturer and a customer. Like well, why can't you try to like develop IP, like because we get orders and revenue from clients who place that with us, not like R&D that we develop on ourselves. And there's a lot of these things that I think you learn. And I think for me, it was just like Where we kind of came down to it was like, well, the insight was whoever owns the inventory, whoever like buys and owns the inventory owns the upside, because their job then is to pass it on to some other person. And a long time ago, that would be like the manufacturer sells it to a distributor who kind of places it in a retailer who, or sorry, sells it to a brand who sells it to a distributor who sells it to a retailer, and then that sells it to a customer. And like the retailer used to do the job of the distribution and the customer acquisition, so they used to really have the pricing power. And then with the internet, I think like between 2005, really started with like Bonobos in 2008, but like I think a lot of people started talking about like cutting out the middleman with the retailer, where brands would no longer have to do retail distribution deals, and instead they could acquire them directly, so that you could cut the price down a little bit because you're taking away the retailer. But at the end of the day, what I realized was like, hey, it doesn't. And we talked to a lot of manufacturers. It doesn't matter if your client is a cutting edge direct to consumer brand or a like 500-year-old legacy brand. To them, you're one and the same. You're just like, all I care about is getting your order, making my margin, and passing, like filling it, and then moving on to the next one, and occupying
Yeah.
production capacity. So I think that's where kind of the idea for Italic came around.
Obviously, this whole model of manufacturing and distribution and retail and all that stuff has been around for so long, and obviously we've seen that changing more and more in the last 10 years with e-commerce and kind of, again, like you said, cutting out the middleman. It's like every middleman is like being cut out these days in every industry. But in this case, like, what do you think happened in 2018, or like why don't you think it had happened by that time, and why was that kind of the right time that you felt like to launch this thing? Like, was there like a convergence in like certain things that kind of led to that point, or like why hadn't nobody done this before?
Yeah, I'd say it's I'd say two things on this. Like, one is, honestly speaking, I don't think if whether it was me or someone else, like I think someone who like deeply understands manufacturing and tech has to will this thing into existence, because otherwise the most natural option here is like, be a brand and your incentive is to buy inventory for the lowest possible cost or decreasing cost every single year, and sell it for the highest possible price point that your customer is willing to pay for it, and rinse and repeat. And I think like it takes a lot of, first of all, it takes a lot of money, but also it takes a lot of discipline to essentially lower your prices and your own take rate to satisfy both like acquiring manufacturers as merchants, and also convincing customers like, hey, this brand is trustworthy, even though there isn't like a traditional brand per se around it. So I think it for Italic, like the conversion, I wouldn't say there's like a single point in time where things converge, but I think like the second point I was going to make is, for us, like the groundwork had been laid, actually I think like maybe 3 years prior. In my opinion, like the ecom and commerce landscape today in the States and most of the West actually looks a lot like where China did in like 2014 to 2015. And I had obviously the advantage of like speaking Chinese and visiting every year as a kid, and I think like at that time, they had really centralized players like we do, in JD and Tmall, which are their equivalents of like our eBays and Amazons. But like the next wave from basically 2015 onwards, you had like companies like Pinduoduo, which pioneered group buying, but more importantly, in my opinion, pioneered a lot of like more middle class consumers purchasing straight from manufacturers as opposed to through retailer brands. You had companies like Xiaomi, which not only like had significant pricing power, but also like introduced marketplaces where in the China market, which is like deeply brand conscious and brand loyal, they were still able to sell like non-branded products straight from the same manufacturers, like high-end brands, to Chinese consumers, which like really care about that logo. I'm generalizing, of course, but like it's a pretty brand loyal market. And I think for me, it's like, okay, well, there seems to be something there, and of course, like I could point to e-commerce and say like, hey, that number is rising every year, year over year, quite quickly. I think this is a great time to start approaching manufacturers. And I mean, I probably got the timing off by maybe like a year or two. Manufacturers, when we first kind of approached, it was still like relatively hey, if you've been doing something a certain way for like 40, 50 years, like you're very skeptical of like the next tech kid who wants to like pitch you this amazing solution. But I think we eventually, like the first year I met with over 150 in person manufacturers in Italy and China and the US, a couple other countries, and only two said like, "Hey, we'll do something with you." And I think that's like what hustle teaches you. But
And
go ahead.
Jeremy, what was your pitch? What was your pitch to those people?
Yeah, so the pitch really actually hasn't changed over the years. What Italic is, I guess to take one step back, what Italic
Yeah.
is today is for consumers, we essentially offer over 1,000 products that we design and develop ourselves, ranging from cookware to apparel to accessories to home goods to bedding. Even nowadays, we have like weight sets and ski goggles, so active products. And our spin on it is that we, went, like I said, and found the same manufacturers as these high end brands, but we don't monetize the products very much. We operate what is essentially like a very, very heavily managed marketplace underneath the hood, so that we can afford to sell these products at a 50 to 80% discount to what comparable direct to consumer brands charge. And also even more so compared to traditional incumbent brands. But for the manufacturer, what we provide is I call it private label in a box. We essentially provide a turnkey service where we empower. Our end goal is to essentially empower the manufacturer to become a merchant of their own, and thereby take kind of going back to the inventory side, like take inventory and thereby take part in the upside of the margin. And specifically by turnkey, I mean, we do the payment orchestration. We have the operational network of partner warehousing. We have our technology portal. We do the cross-border, facilitation and logistics and the fulfillment. And we do the payment processing, the customer support end to end, so that to a customer, you're getting the same level of quality and experience as if you were to purchase from a brand or a retailer. But for the manufacturer, it's a means to access a global market of consumers. So the pitch to the manufacturer really is like, hey, for the first time in your manufacturing history, like you can own your own inventory and sell it to an end customer without having to do all of that stuff that I just named, by yourself. And I think the appeal was like, hey, this is the first time. What I'm really saying is like, this is the first time that like you as a company can own your own destiny and not be like subject to the whims of your clients.
Right.
And I think that message is very appealing to second generation, third generation, like family owners, because a lot of these manufacturers are, family owned. And I think now the ownership is like younger and younger, and they see the rise of like e-com, so they get it. I think that was the that was the pitch.
We talked about the convergence of things, and I think it seems like something changed where on both sides of the sort of the coin, where on the manufacturer side, like these things in the manufacturer retailer relationship or brand relationship, a lot of that was like under wraps or like under behind closed doors for so long, where they didn't want to share who they're working with or what kind of brands, because there's a lot of leverage play there, right? Like they don't want to lose that. But now obviously, like if you go on your website, you can see like, this item, is the same manufacturer as these brands, and they're like really big brands like the Aloes and the Lululemons of the world. And then on the flip side, it's a big change in consumer behavior, because, you mentioned that kind of the logo or like the stamp of approval that a brand puts on a piece of, clothing, for example, if we're talking about clothing, where people are kind of buying for that. It's like a status thing too, right?
And trust.
Status and trust. Exactly. But obviously something changed there too, where it's like, well, if I can feel the quality, obviously I can return it if I don't like it, and it feels good and I like the way it feels on me, and, I trust this company, then yeah, absolutely, I'm willing to pay less, even if there's no logo on that. Something changed there, obviously. So is there anything more to that? Like, do you have anything else to add to that, I guess,
Yeah.
equation?
I mean, you actually, you put it in a really, really good way, actually. I think the way I frame it is like, there's all these studies and consumer reports, if you will, that say like, hey, consumers in the West are like more like they are the least loyal to brands than they have been in like the past however many decades. And I think like, yeah, that objectively speaking is true, but I think like the power of the brand is actually stronger today than it ever was before. And that's partially because I think there's a lot of consumer awareness and education that's happened, talking about like fashion, for example, all these Reddit subreddits for men to learn about, apparel for the first time. Like that's pretty cool. There's all these blogs that like talk about the quality. I think like consumers have, I don't think it's like necessarily brand disloyalty. I think it's more, hey, they have so many more options to purchase today, and so much more, education around like what they should be looking for in terms of quality and design, that that brands have a harder time today to kind of stay relevant, when it comes to like, to give you a better example, like handbags, are probably the best example of this, where if you wanted a quality handbag previously, the only way you would like get that is by buying from like a luxury brand, whose markups are like literally 10x plus, like maybe 20x sometimes. And the reason was like, hey, that's the only, if you wanted a quality bag, like there is literally no other way to get one, than to buy from one of these brands. And of course, it comes with the status symbol of like, hey, you have like a little big logo on one of these bags. But at the end of the day, if you want a nice thing that'll last a while, you're going to buy from one of those brands because you don't have another option. And then I think with direct to consumer, I think it's introduced a whole new class of consumers where they care about like having nice things, and I think they care about like design as well. But like pricing is a really big factor in the purchase decision that, I think most brands kind of like skirt around. I really did love the whole like cutting out the middleman narrative back in like 2008 to maybe 2012 was the heyday. But I feel like it's like changed a lot over the years, where nowadays everyone says it and it's like lost its meaning a lot. But I think at the end of the day, that's what like internet commerce was for, is like you're
Right.
getting cheaper products at a higher quality, like shipped to your door. And that's like really powerful.
Right.
So I think for Italic, like our kind of vision is to go back to that, that original vision of like online commerce being, higher quality product, at the lowest possible price point. Our mission is to essentially provide quality goods and services at the lowest, for our members, at the lowest prices on the internet, and that's like a very tangible thing that we strive for every day. So I could talk on and on about the consumer side. I think the other thing I might
Yeah.
add lastly is just that I think, for the people who buy, branded merchandise, if you're going to buy, like, let's say a Gucci bag versus an Italic bag, you're always going to buy the Gucci bag. There's no competition, right? Like, you want that logo and you want that status. And I think by all means, like, we support that. But I think for the same Gucci customer who cares about that logo on the handbag, they might not care about having like all clad, cookware or frette, bedding. And in those cases, like the Italic option, where it's like heavily, the quality is like comparable and the price point is substantially lower, that's a very strong sell. But then to someone who's like a home chef, who really, really cares about like Le Creuset, Dutch ovens or whatever it is, they might not care about having a big, logo on their handbag. So they might buy it from Kiana, Italic, Everlane, whatever it is. So I think for me, like I really kind of structure it in a standpoint of like, for our customers, we really see them as having like your emotional purchases you're going to buy from brands, and then your rational, like logical, purchase decisions, it's going to be from, value players like Italic.
Yeah.
And that's
And
kind
for
of
that
what
latter
I mean.
group, it's almost like taking away from fast fashion and all the crap that comes along with that, right? Because if it's a price thing, well, you're paying, a much more like lower price for a high quality item that is probably going to last much longer than paying like a slightly less for a really, really cheap quality item that has been the case for the last like 15, 20 years, right? So that's at least like a good piece from like an, just economy or society standpoint of, well, if you're in that category, that's a bit much better option, for longer lasting clothing if you don't want to pay the high price of going to like a Gucci or Louis Vuitton or what have you, right? So yeah.
When I think about Italic and when I first learned about the company, it got me thinking about when there was this company called, I think, Brandless, that
Hmm.
came out, and they did, like, was it food,
Yeah,
or it was like
it's
different
like
food items and whatever,
CPG. Yeah,
right? And I thought it was an interesting concept, but I thought to myself, I don't know, when it comes to my food, I want to know who's making it, right? Like, I trust, for some reason, PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, and their processes, for example. And then I thought to myself, okay, Italic, it's a little different. I'm not ingesting any of this food, or any of these products. So, like you said, that threshold thing early on with your parents and the automotive, I frankly care less. If
Right.
like there's a chip in the spoon, right? It doesn't matter to me. But more than that, I think what Italic has been able to do well is, even if the products themselves don't have a brand that you can trust, they trust the platform that those products are on, right? If there was a product at Whole Foods, for example, that I've never heard of in my life, I'm going to bet that that product must be okay because the quality control that Whole Foods typically does and the processes they have are probably better than random market ABC like down the street, just for example. So, what have been your learnings, having done now Italic for almost 3 years from the consumer side of it? What are some of the stories or the feedback that you've heard back in terms of people buying products because they trust Italic, not necessarily because of the product itself?
Yeah. So what we found is in our customer purchasing decisions, really what they care about is quality, design, and price point. And I think in the first two, they're actually relatively speaking easy for a brand or company to control, right? Like you're designing it, you're developing it. Ultimately, what quality comes down to, in my opinion, is cost of goods sold. So if we have similar COGS to these high-end brands, generally speaking, like we're using similar levels of materials, similar craftsmanship, so on and so forth. Design is obviously much more subjective, but in our case, we try to do everything in-house as much as possible. And when we can, like we try to go for evergreen styles that we believe will be popular today as well as 5 years from now. And I think the way we frame it is like Italic is not like a sexy brand that'll be hot for 5 years and then gone for the next five. We really want to be building products that people would love to kind of wear today or use today, as well as like later on in their life. And I think lastly on price point, it's I think like price is the thing that like no one likes to talk about or kind of think of. Like no one likes to feel like they're buying the cheap option, and I think that's what the issue. Like for what it's worth, I feel like Brandless was like they were on the right track. I think like
Yeah.
the business model just necessitated massive growth. And I think that's where you can kind of get into issues. Also, the product assortment was started from a low ticket, low quality assortment, and they wanted to go upstream from that. Whereas I think for Italic, we're going upstream, and if we set the precedent, like you can trust this as a quality source, you can trust us if we go downstream as well. So.
Right.
I think Brandless could have had and they're still around. I mean, some Utah company bought them, and now they're operating again. So I think they're still onto something. But yeah, I think ultimately for us, when we think about brand, it's really in the concept of the flywheel, where the more members we have, the more leverage we have to acquire manufacturers as merchants. The more manufacturers we have, the more products we can offer, and ultimately the more products we offer. And every single one of these, we have to deliver like consistently to that brand promise, which is this is a high quality product at a truly unbeatable price point, because we're not basically making money on most of them, to a customer that's like, okay, I'm going to trust Italic more and more because I had a good experience with the candles,
Right.
then the bedding, then the towels,
Right.
and so on and so forth.
So Jeremy, is Italic making money from the membership model? I mean, where are you making money? At the end of the day, obviously you're running a business, and sure, you want to fulfill the mission of getting great, price, conscious, let's call it, products to the consumers. Meanwhile, obviously, ideally making more wealth for the manufacturers, which, in my opinion, are truly the backbone of, of the country, of the world, right? Like without somebody making stuff, it doesn't matter if how many sellers there are. So how is Italic, monetizing?
Yeah, we monetize through two ways. One is through our membership. So today, sorry, I was supposed to do this a long time ago, but my team made a small code actually. I think it's italic.com/founder hour, and I think that gets you like 30% or something.
Oh,
Anyways, in case
we'll throw it in the description.
okay,
We'll say it in
perfect.
the intro.
Yeah,
People will know about
amazing.
it. That's a sweet deal. Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. I should have brought that up earlier. But yeah, we make money through the membership, which is basically a pure software services, great margins, and then we also offer what we call like merchant services. So we provide fulfillment, we provide support, we provide all these things that are essentially what brands do, but we turn them into services, and we charge back that those fees to our merchants. So it's really, if you think about it, it's just like it's a marketplace model plus the
Right.
subscription, and
I
that way I
love it.
think we can. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and it's funny. I read somewhere, and you called Italic the modern everything store, right? Which
Yeah.
obviously, when you hear everything store, the first thing that pops to your head is Amazon. because that's what they are, and that's what Bezos always wanted them to be. Um, you know, I again, I don't want to assume here, but is Italic eventually, and is your goal to compete with Amazon?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, hey, there are not many ways to compete against Amazon these days, right? They're very, very good at what they do. Everyone knows it. Anyone who's ever tried to compete with them, I think has obviously, not, they don't always lose, but I think it's not easy. So
Right.
the way we approach it is like, look, we believe, I mean, this is great. If you zoom back like more than 100 years ago, the first like true catalog was Sears, and then the first like superstore after that was Walmart.
Sears Roebuck, right? Or
That's right,
Roebuck.
Sears Roebuck. Yeah, exactly. And Tiffany was around even before then as not as a jewelry kind of brand, but as a catalog. Um, then it was Walmart, and then Costco came around like 20, 30 years after. And then Amazon really is what Costco and Walmart do offline, but online. And I think they digitized the experience the best possible way. I think the next possible kind of consumer shift in behavior is like trusting online brands, which you already see with all these direct to consumer brands, but being able to purchase everything, not just like the nice to have. I mean, the framing I have is like we are today Uber Black, and we want to get to Uber X, where
Right.
even our products today, like they're still relatively speaking pretty expensive for most middle class Americans. We have a long ways to go on improving that, but I think for our vision, it's like, yeah, we want to compete on as many categories as possible. I mean, we have all sorts of things planned, and also all sorts of manufacturers reaching out, and our job is to screen through those categories and manufacturers
Right.
and find the best possible few for each. And yeah, I think that's the end goal. I mean, hey, we're years
Yeah.
away, so we'll
No,
try to get
I
there.
think, Jeremy, I think it's a great goal, and the reason I asked was because Pat and I are always following, everything happening in technology startups. I mean, the podcast really helps us kind of stay up to date with everything, and we're so happy that we got to talk to you early on, because I hope that in the next 10 to 20 years you do become Jeff Bezos, and even wealthier and more influential than him, and the three of us will be friends. But even beyond that, because I think that that's secondary. When again, coming back to my dad's manufacturing business, I always remember asking him when I was a kid, like, Dad, you're doing all this great work. Like, why aren't you just selling it yourself, right? Like, why aren't you the brand? Like, and then as I grew older and understood marketing and branding and sales, I was like, Dad, why don't I sell it for you? And me and Pat are both Armenian, so our families come from, we have an Armenian background. He's a one man show. He's manufacturing all by himself. He has to scale the business, which means he has to bring on more people. If he's doing it himself, he has to pay for marketing and advertising and this and that, and have to go get distribution. And so it becomes like this time suck, and it goes from having multiple customers that he does work for to just himself. But it's awesome to see a tool like Italic, a service like Italic, that could help essentially these folks do both, right? Service their existing customers, and then also have another way of essentially making money. Do you foresee, like Amazon has done with their third party sellers, eventually where people can literally go on Italic, sign up, and say, you know what, this is what we manufacture. We're a manufacturing company. Obviously, you guys do the QC on your end, making sure that their standards are up with Italic, and then they sell on their own. They sell on your platform. They get the money. You guys handle distribution for them in your warehouses, etc. Is that what the vision is for Italic?
Yeah, I mean the vision really is to empower. It's two sided, but it's to empower manufacturers to become merchants. And our job is to make that as seamless and turnkey as possible, in a fair way where they can make money for themselves. And then I think the consumer side is like we want to provide quality goods and services for the lowest prices on the internet, and that's really it's. I mean, you can apply that in many different ways, but I think in that example, like the goal would be to have the services set up so that like you and your dad could essentially get up and running, and we do all of like we do everything end to end, and all you have to worry about is just like, okay, here are my products, here are my sell through. I have a category manager for let's say jewelry that will help me suggest like things that they think like the market will respond well to. I can look at customer data on a anonymized benchmark system. Like there's a lot of things that I think we can provide as a software toolkit, but also in the physical world as well, where we can provide Italic, what we call fulfilled by Italic FBI, where you can send your yeah. So yeah, I mean, we'd love to get there, but obviously, like, I mean, hey, Amazon's more than it's like 30 years old now, so we got a long ways to go.
Yeah, and Amazon is, I mean, they've gone from being just like the everything store to like just owning I mean, like I work in real estate and they own like the most real estate at this point, in the if not in the world, but in the country. And so I think that that's not to say Italic
you either die a villain or live long enough to fucking own real estate. I guess.
No, I mean, look, it's not to say that a company like Amazon can't go down. It's funny because I was thinking about this yesterday with this whole like David Dobrik stuff of like how fast like somebody like that can rise and how fast they can fall. And I'm not saying Amazon's going to fall fast, but you can't predict, what happens to companies and what and where innovation from other companies takes them. And I mean, who knows? I mean, I think what you've done with Italic is obviously phenomenal, and this is just like the early stages. I guess when you're not, what do you do when you're not doing Italic? Because you're still a young dude, are you exclusively just working on Italic these days?
I mean, look, I know founders are supposed to have like a good I take care of myself and I have routines and have. I mean, I try, but realistically speaking, like no. I mean,
how many hours a day are you on Twitter and Clubhouse?
0. I deleted
Perfect.
Twitter.
That's what I like to hear.
Clubhouse, it was fun early on, but I don't know. It's it's hard to balance. It's hard to balance like life and I think like startups. So, but you know how it is. It's kind of what you sign up for, and that's why I genuinely believe like most people should not be founders or even kind of think about it. So.
You also I think I read that you and your is it your girlfriend that you guys have another company, Not Pot? What's that all about?
Yeah, Not Pot. So we started Not Pot actually while I think I was still at Fountain End, and at the time it was like, hey, would love to kind of help her kind of build a business of her own. I mean, that's what I knew well. So that's like my way of showing love in a way where, and at the time we had
build the business. Just love
right. So we were selling like coconut butters with like different interesting ingredients mixed in at the time, and one of those ingredients was like, this was back in 2016, 2017. That was like CBD was still like pretty gray area. And we started selling like chocolates with that ingredient mixed in, and it kind of like exploded. So we turned that into a business called Not Pot, and today it's like it's a really, really cool, like it's the opposite of Italic in every way. It's bootstrapped, it's deeply brand heavy. For like 3-4 years now, we've every month we like donate money to pay for someone's bail, like depending on the bail program. Like we've been doing it for a long time, but yeah, it's hard to balance everything, that's for sure. But I mean, for me, like Italic is quite intensive.
That's awesome. Well, Jeremy, this has been one of those conversations where I feel like if we don't stop it now, we're going to go on for hours. And it's been such a blast, just kind of hearing your journey, but also what you're doing with Italic. It's so innovative and so awesome. And like I said, we're both huge fans. And thanks again for that code. We'll share it with our listeners, and hopefully more people can check it out and see the awesome stuff you guys are doing. But yeah, all the best to you. We'll be following your journey and rooting for you. And hopefully we can meet in person someday soon. But this has been great.
Yeah, hey, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Jeremy.